On a bright March morning in Riyadh, where oil wealth and ambition glistened through the marble halls of the King Abdulaziz Conference Center, world leaders gathered to shape the future of global investment. It was a summit dominated by billionaires, tech tycoons, and heads of state,
among them
whose signatures could shift economies. Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, a landlocked West African nation with a GDP dwarfed by many attendees' weekend shopping bills. Whispers filled the room. What could this young African leader possibly offer amidst pitches about AI, clean energy, dressed not in a tailored Western suit, but in his national military uniform, eyebrows raised? No entourage, no glossy presentations, just a calm presence and a quiet confidence that something profound was about to unfold. Scheduled as the final speaker, Traoré took the stage as minds wandered toward dinner reservations. Yet within moments of speaking, the room fell utterly silent. He posed a simple question. When you close your eyes and imagine the future, what do you see? No statistics, no gratitude, but of partnership. He presented a bold vision: the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, a massive African-led project to connect 12 countries through roads, rail, energy, and data networks, designed by African engineers for African people. At a cost of $800 million, it was modest by Saudi standards, yet transformative. Mohammed bin Salman in the eye and said, "Your greatest legacy will not be the tallest building or fastest train, but proving that power lies not in domination, charged with the weight of history." For once, Africa was not begging, it was inviting. The Crown Prince stood and responded not with polite applause, but commitment. Saudi Arabia would invest $500 million in the corridor's first phase and create a permanent Africa Partnership office in Riyadh. In a gesture without precedent, he invited Traoré to chair its advisory board. Stock markets surged, African leaders reached out, and a wave of excitement swept the continent. Not because of the money, but because of the message: Africa is not a subject. Faso, villagers gathered around radios to hear the news. And in the village of Gongo, young Musa, once unable to read by electric light, now dreamed of becoming an engineer who would more than a diplomatic success. It rewrote the script. It proved that dignity is stronger than dependence, and that when leaders speak with courage, even the smallest nations, landlocked African nation, walks into the richest room on earth and refuses to beg. In the heart of Riyadh, surrounded by oil billionaires and global power players, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't come with a briefcase or a slideshow. He came with a challenge: no aid, no charity, just one bold question that stunned the entire room. This wasn't just a speech, it was a moment that shook 3 continents. If you're tired of hearing the same stories told by the same voices, you need to hear this one. Hit like, subscribe. Let's rewrite the script together. If you believe that even a small nation can stand tall before the giants of the world. If you believe that Africa deserves to write its own story in its own voice, not through borrowed words. If you've seen the fire burning in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, then this story belongs to you. Subscribe to this channel, not just to support it, but to walk alongside it. Together through a wave of awakening. The whispers have become a silent storm. Now, it's time to listen. In the marble halls of Riyadh, the most powerful people on earth had gathered. CEOs, princes, presidents, everyone had come to pitch, but no one expected Captain Ibrahim Traoré to matter. His country, Burkina Faso, was barely a footnote on the global map. So when he walked in young, in military uniform, without notes or a polished team, people barely glanced up. But that was about to change. He wasn't there to ask for favors. He was there to challenge the room itself. When he finally spoke, no one saw it coming. When you imagine the future, what do you see? Not statistics, not gratitude, just a question. He didn't mention poverty aid or need. Instead, he revealed a vision: the Trans-Sahel Corridor. 12 nations, roads, power, connectivity, dared to ask African the richest kingdom in the world not to donate but to partner. And he did it with no PowerPoint, no buzzwords, just truth. The Crown Prince leaned in, The room held its breath. Then came the line that changed everything. "We don't need rescuing, we need respect." Captain Traoré wasn't pleading, he was rewriting the rules. He painted a future where Africa was no longer a continent of receivers, but of builders. A moment earlier, some had looked at their phones. Now every eye was fixed on him. This wasn't just a speech, it was an invitation to be part of something historic. A new model of diplomacy, south to south, eye to eye, not top down. What came next made history. Mohammed bin Salman, usually measured and guarded, stood up. Not only did he pledge $500 million to the Sahel corridor, he invited Traoré to chair a new African Advisory Council in Riyadh, a role never before offered to any African leader.
This wasn't
the
a
room
gesture.
Once skeptical,
It was
now
a
realignment of global power. The richest man in the room had just shaken hands with the most honest one, and meant it. In Burkina Faso, radios crackled with the news. In Gongo, little Musa, once studying by candlelight, now dreamt of becoming an engineer. Across Africa, something shifted. No longer whispers. A silent storm was rising. Traoré didn't come to beg, he came to build. And now others are joining him, not with pity, but with purpose. If a forgotten nation can rewrite the future in the world's richest room, maybe the real wealth was never oil, it was courage. And yet, into that room walked Captain Ibrahim. The marble shone like glass. Every chair was filled with men in suits worth more than his country's education budget. Private jets lined the Riyadh tarmac like polished weapons of wealth. This was a summit for superpowers, not for Burkina Faso. But he stepped in anyway. No entourage, no aide whispering talking points, no silk tie or designer lapel pin. Just him, a 35-year-old soldier from one of the world's poorest nations, wearing the uniform of his people stitched with pride, but not money. Others raised their eyebrows. Burkina, what someone muttered. The German delegation glanced at one another. A few CEOs smirked. Someone actually chuckled. They all had their presentations ready, graphs, charts, impact forecasts.
Captain Ibrahim
This
Traoré
man didn't even have a tablet. He scanned the room. He knew what they were thinking. Wrong level, wrong man. They were wrong. Because sometimes the person with the least to prove walks in with the most to say. Sometimes power isn't in the posture, it's in the purpose. And Traoré's purpose wasn't just to attend.
He stood at the edge unnoticed,
disrupt. Quiet, still, watching, waiting. As the voices echoed and deals whispered into champagne flutes, no one realized that history was standing in the corner, listening. Burkina Faso had entered the room. By the time he left, the entire balance of the summit, and perhaps of Africa's place in the world, would shift. First silence. Before the world listened, it had to dismiss exactly what they did. He opened his mouth. Then, when the room least expected it, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was called to speak. Minds had begun to wander. Delegates checked their phones. A few whispered about dinner plans. The day had been long, slide after slide, projection after projection. Everyone had already decided who the favorites were. No one expected anything significant from the final speech. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President Ibrahim Traoré. A round of applause followed. One or two claps too slow. One or two claps too soon. It sounded more like obligation with steady, deliberate steps. No laptop, no notes, no translator, just a man with a message. And then silence. He stood there for several seconds saying nothing, just scanning the room, locking eyes with different groups. Not nervously, not shyly, but with purpose. The silence stretched beyond comfort. Then he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a blade. Honorable delegates, I have only one question for you. The room leaned in. You close your eyes and imagine the future. What do you see? No introduction, no thanks, no flattery. Like a punch to the chest. Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak like a politician. He didn't talk about Burkina Faso's GDP. He didn't beg for aid. Instead, he didn't list statistics. A future built not with money, but with a boy named Musa from the village of Gongo, who had never seen electricity, not until last month. He described the boy's first thought when the lights came on. Not games, not comfort, but how to build some. Posture changed, phones were set down. This was no longer a formality. Then came the vision, the Trans-Sahel corridor. 12 nations, 8,000 kilometers. A network to unite the heart of Africa. Roads, power lines, data cables. All African built, all African-owned. It was a mirror held up to invest in what we have, Captain Traoré, who we are. What followed next, no one in the room Traoré didn't stop with Musa, or the corridors or infrastructure. He paused, let the silence return, and then stepped off the stage. Slowly, calmly, down to the floor, walking unsure whether to move. The delegates, confused, captivated, leaned forward, and then he said it. "I am not here to ask for charity," he began. "I am not here to sell you a dream that flatters you. I am here to tell you what we are already building with or without you." Murmurs. Now this wasn't just unexpected, it was uncomfortable. As a continent in need. But I stand here as a partner, and I ask, when was the last time you invested not in stability, not in profit, but in dignity? Word hit hard. Some shuffled in their seats. A few smirked. One oil executive rolled his eyes. But the crown prince didn't move. His face was unreadable. His fingers steepled beneath his chin. Ibrahim Traoré invested in silicon and steel, in AI and satellites, in skyscrapers that kiss the sky. But tell me, who will dream in those towers? Who will create with those machines? Who will lead with those tools? Like a professor in a classroom of kings. Not as statistics, not as headlines, photograph again, but as Musa. A boy born in darkness, now dreaming under electric light, will connect more than towns. It will connect potential to purpose. Came the line that changed every rescuing. We need respect. Feel the room tighten. Someone coughed. Another scribbled a note. Someone else whispered into their phone. No one laughed now, because what Captain Ibrahim Traoré had just done was flip the script. He didn't speak as a poor leader seeking favors. He spoke as a mirror held up to the world's wealth, asking not for money, but for not their wallets, but their values. The powerful man in the room, Mohammed bin Salman, hadn't blinked. Not yet. Because sometimes the most dangerous idea in a room full of power is a man who believes he did not come to be accepted. He came to be heard. And now finally he was. And then finally the silence broke. Not with whispers, Mohammed but with bin Salman, Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, slowly stood from his chair. It was a simple gesture, but in that room, in that moment, told too. Not at this level, not at this summit, but there he was, not unless of his own accord, his gaze fixed on Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He simply nodded once, then began to speak. His voice was low, almost conversational, but every ear tuned in. In the last 5 years, I've heard thousands of investment proposals. Many have come here seeking our capital. Some wanted our influence, others our reach. But you paused. You are the first to ask what we could become. The entire room froze. This was no longer just an African leader's bold speech. This was the future architect of Saudi Arabia's global legacy. Forward his words, deliberate not with anger, but with vision. Not with desperation, but with dignity. He turned to the rest of the room. That he declared is exactly the kind of partnership Vision 2030 was created for. Audible. Therefore, he continued, I am announcing that the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia will commit $500 million to the first phase of the Trans-Sahel corridor. Some delegates straightened in their seats. Others glanced around, unsure whether to clap or sit in stunned silence. The Crown Prince wasn't finished. Additionally, he said, we will establish a permanent African Partnership Office here in Riyadh, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a strategic anchor for South-South cooperation. And I would be honored, President Traoré, if you would serve as chair of its advisory but in emotion. The atmosphere cracked open, expressions of surprise, of reflection, of respect. This had never happened before. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had not only spoken truth to power, he had shifted power itself. He had drawn a new line across the map, one not based on old empires or traditional alliances, but on courage and clarity. He simply nodded once his eyes steadied. 2 men, one from the desert kingdoms of the Middle East, one from the dusty villages of West Africa, stood as equals, not because of wealth, not because of tradition, but because vision restrained, thoughtful. But the energy had changed. People were no longer looking at their phones. They were looking at Traoré. They were seeing him. They were seeing Africa, not as a burden, but as a blueprint of something new. This was no longer about trade. This was about legacy, certainly. Below is Step 10, expansion of Body Point 5, into an 800-word passage, written in native-level British English. It maintains an emotional cinematic tone, with short, punchy sentences, natural pacing, and strong narrative suspense. It continues seamlessly from the previous body sections and develops the broader impact of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's speech from Riyadh to Gango, while tying it to the original hook and vision. The applause faded,
What Captain Ibrahim
but the
Traoré
ripple
had
sparked
only
in
just
that hall
begun.
didn't end with a handshake or a headline. It traveled far beyond the marble of Riyadh, beyond the towers and the press briefings. It made its way home. First to Ouagadougou, then to Bamako, then to Niamey, and then to a small luxury cars. No skyscrapers, just dust children and hope. On that very evening, crowds gathered around the only working radio at the edge of the square. They listened not for promises, but
the
for
name
proof.
of
Their president, and they wept.
Not out of pity,
out of pride. They heard that Captain Ibrahim Traoré, their son, had stood before princes and CEOs and spoken with the voice of a continent, that he had not begged but declared, that he had not asked for mercy but demanded respect. They understood something had changed.
Years,
Africa had been invited to the table only to listen. Now it was speaking, loudly.
Summit,
Social media lit up across the continent. Young Africans from Lagos to Lusaka posted clips of Traoré's speech with captions like, "This is how you walk into history." Others wrote, "We are not poor. We are powerful if we stand together." It wasn't just a political moment. It was a generational ignition. Trans-Sahel corridor, once a proposal dismissed by economists as overly ambitious, suddenly looked inevitable. Banks that had previously shown hesitation began asking to join consortia. Regional leaders called for urgent meetings to integrate their own development plans into the new blueprint. Countries that once competed for Western approval now turned toward each other and asked,
Saudi
what
engineers
were already mobilizing. Surveyors were sent. Feasibility studies launched. But this was not a traditional foreign-led project. They were working with not for the first time, Saudi financial institutions signed co-design agreements with African ministries. Not aid, not debt traps. Actual joint ventures. African engineers would work side by side with Saudi architects. African laborers would be paid fair wages. African governments would retain ownership of every drawn a red line in the sand. And now both sides of it were building forward. Quiet meetings were held in Washington, Brussels, and Paris. There was concern not because of the money, but because power flowed one way. Now it was flowing. That made some people very, very nervous. But it was too late. The storm had already begun. Universities across Africa, students were discussing South-South cooperation, not as theory, but as policy. Professors rewrote syllabi. Think tanks published papers titled The Riyadh Model. Newspapers in Morocco and Mozambique ran editorials asking, new optimism began to spread. Brazil reached out to Nigeria. India approached Tanzania. Mexico opened a locked door, and others had realized it had never truly been locked. At the heart of it stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The world praised him. He stayed silent quietly. No parade, no staged press tour. When asked for comment by reporters, he simply said, nothing if it doesn't lead to building. Build he did. In 3 months, a Sahel Infrastructure Coordination Office was set up in Ouagadougou, staffed by Burkina officials and Saudi technical teams. Progress reports were published every 30 days. Procurement contracts were made transparent. Local councils were consulted at every stage of the blueprint. This was not politics. This was reform. 1 year later, the first foundation stone was laid just outside the village of Gango, where Musa, the boy in Traoré's photo, stood watching. That night, for the first time, Musa studied under solar-powered light, built by an African Saudi team. He no longer dreamed of escape. He dreamed of building. As dusk settled across the Sahel, something remarkable happened. In silence, without fireworks or fanfare, history had shifted. Noise, but with nerve. Not by force, but by faith. In a new generation of African leadership. Respect could replace charity. Dignity could be a strategy, not just look back on it. They wouldn't just remember the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked into the richest room in the world and reminded it what wealth truly means. History doesn't always shout when it changes. Sometimes it speaks in a quiet voice. Sometimes it wears a faded uniform. Sometimes it stands at a podium with no notes, no slides, and simply asks the world to listen. That's what happened in Riyadh. Not with bombs or elections, not with sanctions or speeches prepared by PR firms, but with conviction. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the kind that doesn't go to Saudi Arabia to play the old game. He went to flip the table. And he did not by defying power, but had forgotten that true leadership is not about wealth, but will. That the poorest man in the room can sometimes be the richest in clarity. That respect cannot be bought, it must be earned or demanded. He demanded it. Not just for himself, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that has ever been told to wait its turn. For every voice ignored because it didn't speak with an accent of empire. For every child like Musa, who deserves not just light to study, but the right to build. What followed that day was not a departure from the past. A world where aid was dressed up as help, but always came with chains. From a world where Africa was spoken about but never to. From a world where investment meant control and partnership was just another word for ownership. Traoré offered something different. The world for once said yes. The beginning of something bigger, a model for South-South cooperation built not on dependence but shared ambition. It wasn't just about bridges, trains, or wires. It was about rewiring once erased from maps and headlines, had suddenly become the blueprint for how dignity could reshape diplomacy. All it took was one man refusing to beg. If you're listening now, this story is not just his. It's ours. It belongs to anyone who still believes that courage can cut through the noise. That vision can move more than markets. That one honest voice in the right room can redraw the map. Traoré didn't ask to be part of history. He insisted on it. From that moment, so did Africa. If you still believe that a small nation can stand tall in the face of global giants, if you believe Africa has the right to write its own story in its own voice, not through the lens of old powers, if you've seen the fire in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's eyes, the fire that doesn't beg, doesn't flinch, and never backs down, then this story isn't just about him who refused to accept the world as it is and dare to imagine it. Subscribe to this channel, not for applause, not for numbers, but to stand together in this rising wave of awakening. Because the whispers are over, comes the storm. The story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Riyadh is not simply about a speech, nor about a funding deal, or a diplomatic breakthrough. It is about the quiet power of belief, the unshakable strength of dignity, and the moment a continent decided it would no longer wait to be noticed. It teaches us that leadership is not defined by wealth, influence, or military might, but by clarity, courage, and the refusal to be silenced. When Traoré walked into a room designed to intimidate, filled with people who had already written him off, he carried nothing but his voice and his truth. And it was enough to shift the balance of an entire conversation. Sometimes the most powerful force in any space is not the one who speaks loudest, but the one who speaks last and speaks from the heart. In a world obsessed with data polish and power plays, Captain Traoré reminded us of something older and deeper, that people respond to purpose. They respond to conviction that cannot be faked. He did not try to impress the crown prince with forecasts or trends. He simply told the truth about his people and then dared to invite one of the world's most powerful men to help build something meaningful. Also reminds us not just that Africa does not need to beg to be part of the global conversation. It is the conversation. With its youthful population, immense resources, and strategic geography, the continent holds more potential than it has ever been allowed to realize. And yet the real shift happens not when others decide to see it, but when African leaders demand to be seen on their own terms. Traoré did not ask to be included. He redefined what inclusion meant. He did not speak as a victim of history, but as an author shows us that partnership is stronger than patronage, that the most sustainable development happens not through charity, but through cooperation built on respect and equality. When one of the world's richest countries chose to back a project not out of pity, but belief, a new model emerged. And it will inspire others across the global south and beyond to realize that the path forward does not need to be inherited. Before the speech, it can be to the standing ovation after it, one truth became clear: real change does not start with applause. It starts with a decision to show up, to speak boldly, to represent those who cannot yet speak for themselves, and to never lower your head even when the room tells you that you walked into that room as a guest. So can we. He walked out. Remember what he taught us. As a viewer, I wasn't just moved by the speech, I was transformed by it. Watching Captain Ibrahim Traoré stand in that room surrounded by power, privilege, and polished diplomacy reminded me of what real leadership looks like. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention through noise or wealth. It commands it through clarity, conviction, and courage. This story didn't feel like another political video. It felt like a turning point, not just for Burkina Faso or Africa, but for the entire global conversation about dignity. When he asked the room, "When you imagine the future, what do you see?" It was a question that reached through the screen and grabbed me. Because too often the future has been imagined for Africa, not by Africa. And in that moment, Traoré didn't just challenge the Crown Prince or the delegates, he challenged all of us. He challenged our assumptions. He challenged the way we define power. He reminded us that you don't need to be rich to be right,
What stayed with
and
me
you don't
most
need to be
was
loud. The way
to
he
be
refused to beg. That was powerful. He didn't stand there asking for help, he stood offering a partnership. And when Saudi Arabia responded not with pity but with action, it gave me hope that maybe the world is starting to listen differently. Maybe, just maybe, we're finally at the beginning of a new kind of cooperation, one built on mutual respect, not silent scrolling. I had to pause. I had to reflect. Because this wasn't just a story about international development or investment. It was a reminder that dignity is a form of resistance, and that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a quiet voice
that
and
moment
and that fire in Captain Traoré's eyes for a long time.